In this section we'll look at adding or subtracting fractions, including mixed numbers. This is something you should already be familiar with, something you would have done in the broad general education. So we'll move through this quite quickly. Before we can add or subtract fractions, the most important thing is we have a common denominator. This means the numbers at the bottom of the fractions, for me to add these two fractions together, these two numbers at the bottom must be the same as each other. Now in this case, 3 and 5, there's not a common denominator here, these numbers aren't the same. So what we need to do is we need to find the lowest common multiple of 3 and 5. Now, when I'm doing these questions, the first thing I like to do is very quickly on the second line down, just write out two empty fractions. So a fraction plus a fraction. What we then need is we need to find the lowest common multiple of 3 and 5. So what we might also call the lowest common denominator. So we can do it two ways. We can go up our 3 times table and stop when we get to a number in the 5 times table, or go up our 5 times table and stop when we get to a number in the 3 times table. So going up our 3 times table, 3, 6, 9, 12, 15. 15 is the first number we get to, which is in the 5 times table as well. So that can be our common denominator. It works because 3 will divide into 15 and 5 will divide into 15. So step 1, lowest common denominator is 15, so start with something over 15 plus something over 15. What we then have to do is we then need to ask ourselves, what do I multiply this 3 by in order to turn it into 15? So 3 times what gives me 15? Now hopefully you know the answer to that is 3 times 5 gives me 15. So if I had to multiply the bottom by 5, I must multiply the top by 5 so that these two fractions are equivalent. So 1 times 5 is 5. That means 1/3 is the same as 5/15. What I then do is I move to the second fraction. It's like treating it as pretty much a separate question, and I ask the same thing again. So I say, what do I multiply 5 by to get 15? Now, it's 5 times 3 is 15, so I've had to multiply this 5 by 3 to get 15, so I need to multiply the top by 3 as well. So 2 times 3 is 6. So the trick here is to simply ask yourself at each fraction, what do I multiply the bottom by to get the new bottom, and then multiply the top by the same amount. We'll just show this down the side what our steps for this question were. So first fraction, we multiplied the denominator by 5, so we multiplied the numerator by 5 too. In the second fraction, we multiplied the denominator by 3, so we multiplied the numerator by 3 also. And then lastly, we come to the point where we're going to add these two fractions together, and all we do is we add the numerators, we add the top parts. So 5 plus 6 is 11, and the denominator does not change. We're not adding the denominators here. The values are at the top. The denominator there is just to tell us how much each part at the top is worth. So we don't add the 15s, we only add the top numbers. Down the side here, we'll just show our last step, which is to add the fractions. So we'll look at a few more examples here. So in part B, we have 5/6 take away 2/3. So again, what we're going to do is we're going to write out two empty fractions. So first fraction, take away the second fraction. We're then going to look at the denominator, 6 and 3. Now this is not a common denominator. These are obviously different. We need to make them the same number. So I need the lowest common multiple of 6 and 3. So the lowest number which is in the 6 times table and in the 3 times table. So go up your 6 times table, stop when you get to a number in the 3 times table. So 6, there we go, straight away. The first number in the 6 times table is 6, and it's also in the 3 times table. So it's my lowest common multiple. What I've then got to do is go through each of these two fractions one at a time. We'll start with the 5/6 here. What do I multiply 6 by to get 6? Well, it's not changing, so I multiply it by 1, and that means I multiply the top by 1 as well. So 5 times 1 is 5. Now, you can say multiply by 1 here, or you can just say, as I quite often do, we're not changing the bottom here, so we're not changing the top either. That's just another way to think about it. For the second fraction, what do I multiply the bottom by to get the new bottom? What do I multiply 3 by to get 6? So I have to multiply the bottom here by 2, which means I need to multiply the top by 2. So 2 times 2 gives us 4. All I then need to do is do 5 take away 4, which is 1. And remember, we don't subtract the denominators, so it remains as 6, giving us 1/6. For part C here, again, step 1, two empty fractions is a good first step. And then basically what we want to do is again, find a common denominator. for this 8 and this 6. So what I'm looking for is the lowest common multiple of 8 and 6. So I can choose either one of these times tables to go up and just look out for a number which is in the other times table as well. So we'll do the 8 times table. So 8, well that's not in the 6 times table. So 16, not in the 6 times table. 24, that is in the 6 times table. So 24 is the first number which appears in both the 8 and the 6 times table. We're then going to ask ourselves what do I multiply the bottom by to get the new bottom. So I multiply 8 by 3. So I multiply the bottom by 3 means I multiply the top by 3 as well, giving me 15. What do I multiply 6 by to get 24? I have to multiply the bottom part here by 4. So I need to multiply the top part by 4. So 5 times 4 is 20. And again, I can add those together. Now 15 plus 20 is 35 out of 24. Now there's a couple of things I would usually check at the end of one of these questions. The first is, can that fraction be simplified? Now, 35 over 24, there's no number apart from 1 that divides into 35 and 24, so it can't be simplified. And the other thing I might do is I might change it to a mixed number. So 24 goes into 35 once, remainder 11. So 1 and 11 24ths. Both of these answers here are okay. In other words, I could have stopped quite happily at this stage and that would have been perfectly acceptable as an answer. Or I can change it into a mixed number, and again that's also perfectly acceptable as an answer. We'll now look at adding and subtracting mixed numbers. Now mixed numbers work pretty much the same way as adding our proper fractions. We still need a common denominator and we work out that common denominator in the same way. We scale our fractions in the same way. The only thing that's different is we have a whole number in front of that proper fraction to deal with. Occasionally it will cause a little bit of extra work. So let's take a look at this first example, part A here. Okay, so we've got 1 1/4 plus 2 1/3. Just like with proper fractions, the first step I would take here is simply to write out my empty fractions. Now, the 1 at the start is not going to change, so 1 and a fraction plus 2 and a fraction. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to look at these two fractions here and say, do they have a common denominator? Now 4 and 3 are obviously different, so we need the lowest common multiple of 4 and 3. So I can go up one of my times tables here and stop when I get to a number in the other times table. So 4, 8, 12. 12 is the lowest common multiple of 4 and 3. In other words, the first number in the 4 and the 3 times table. I've then got to do the same as we did with the proper fractions on the last slide. What do I multiply the bottom by to get the new bottom? So 4 times what is 12? 4 times 3 is 12, so if I've multiplied the bottom by 3, I multiply the top by 3 as well. So 1 times 3 is 3. If I then move on to the second fraction here, I have to take this 3 and multiply it by 4 to get 12. So if I've multiplied the bottom by 4, I need to multiply the top number by 4 also. So 1 times 4 is 4. We can then add these fractions together, starting with the whole numbers. So the whole numbers are 1 and 2. We're going to add them together to get 3. And then we're going to look at the fractions. 3 twelfths plus 4 twelfths, which is simply 7 twelfths. And we can leave our answer like that. Now, it won't always work out that easily. So let's have a look at part B, which is there's a wee added complication in part B. So empty fractions first, 5 and a fraction plus 2 and a fraction. We're then going to look at our denominators, 4 and 3. It's the same denominators we had over here, so let's just use that. We know the common denominator will be 12, the lowest common multiple of 4 and 3. We've then got to take our bottom part here, 4, and say what do I multiply it by to get 12. So I have to multiply 4 by 3. So if I've multiplied the bottom by 3, I must multiply the top by 3 as well. And that's going to give me 3 3s 9. Here, I have to multiply the bottom by 4. So I need to multiply the top by 4 as well. So 2 times 4 gives me 8. When I come to add the fractions here, it's a little bit different to the previous question because I get 5 plus 2 is 7, that's fine, and 9 plus 8 is 17. Now, that's going to give us 9 twelfths plus 8 twelfths gives us 17 twelfths. There is a problem with that though, because this part here is a mixed number with an improper fraction in it. That's not okay, we can't leave it like that. Now we can leave it like that on that line of working, but we're going to need to change it. So think about this 17/12 here. 17/12 can be changed into 1 and 5/12. Remember, 17 divided by 12 is 1 remainder 5, so 1 and 5/12. What we can do with that 1 is we can add it onto the 7, so our whole number becomes 8, and what we can then do is we can take this 5/12 we'd be left with and just put it next to that, and we end up with 8 and 5/12. We'll now do these two subtraction questions, C and D. Again, the first one's a fairly straightforward, it's mixed number subtraction, and the one after has a wee extra complication in it, so let's have a look. Let's start off with our empty fraction. So 7 and 2/3 minus 1 and 2/5. Well, we're going to change it to 7 and some fraction, take away 1 and some fraction. What we need is a common denominator from our 3 and our 5. So we're going to go up our 3 times table, stop when we get to a number in the 5 times table. So it's 3, 6, 9, 12, 15, and there we go. 15 is the first number that appears in both of those times tables. What I can then do is say, well, what do I multiply the bottom here by to get 15? The bottom has to be multiplied by 5, so the top needs to be multiplied by 5. So 2 times 5 is 10. And again, with the second fraction, go through the same process. What do I multiply this 5 by at the bottom here to get 15? So I multiply the bottom by 3, so I have to multiply the top by 3. So 2 3s would give me a 6 up here. When I come to subtracting, whole numbers first, so 7 take away 1, that's going to give me 6, and then the fraction part 10/15 take away 6/15 will leave me with 4/15. And lastly, we'll look at part D. Now part D is slightly more complicated than the others, so let's make a start in the same way. We're going to start off by putting in our empty fractions, 5 and a fraction, take away 2 and a fraction. Same process to the start. 4 and 5, we need a common denominator. So lowest common multiple of 4 and 5 is 20. It's the first number which appears in the 4 and the 5 times tables. And then we're just going to follow the same process again. So what have I to multiply the bottom here by to get the new bottom? So what do I multiply 4 by to get 20? Okay, then that's going to be 5. So I've multiplied the bottom by 5, so I need to multiply the top number by 5 as well. So 5 times 1 is 5. Moving on to the second fraction, what do I multiply the bottom by to get this 20? So I multiply the bottom by 4 to get 20, so I multiply the top by 4 also. So 2 multiplied by 4 will give me 8. Now the problem here is I can easily do 5 take away 2, that's no issue, but here 5/20 take away 8/20 would start getting me into negative fractions, which I really want to avoid. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to try and deal with this 5/20 take away 8/20 by borrowing from this 5. So if I want to borrow from the 5, I need to think about what kind of fractions I'm dealing with here. So at the moment I'm dealing with 20ths. Now what you may or may not know is I can write the number 1 in a number of different ways. So because I'm dealing in 20ths, I'm going to write the number 1 as 20/20. Okay, so that makes sense, doesn't it? Because 20 divided by 20 is equal to 1. That means if I want to borrow 1 from the 5, I don't think of it as borrowing 1 from the 5, I can think of it as borrowing 20/20. So when I borrow that 20/20 from the 5, it will leave me with 1 less, so it will leave me with 4. The 20/20 that I borrow need to be added on to the 5/20 I already had here. So remember, I'm borrowing 1, which is 20/20. I'm adding it on to the 5/20 I already had, which means I now have 25/20 here. Now, these two fractions, this 5 and 5/20 and this 4 and 25/20, these have exactly the same value. All I've done is I've moved 1 from the 5 and moved it over into here. So again, just to go through that, I've borrowed 1, which I'm thinking about as 20/20 because we're dealing in 20ths, and I've moved it across to be with this 5/20, giving me 25/20. What that means is I can then quite easily just write out the second part as it was, and then do the subtraction. So 4 take away 2 is 2, 25 take away 8 is 17/20.